Everybody's familiar with the concept of role-playing, filling somebody else's shoes with your cognition for an extravagant palette of purposes, ranging from formal education to simple escapism when reality is less than desirable. It's a practice that transcends digital media and has been known to exist as long as pen and paper has. Visionaries with glamorous tabletop tales use their adventures as the basis for not only their fantasies, but ours as well. We've become valiant knights traversing across uncharted lands, fought hordes of carnivorous creatures, stalking bystanders from the shadows, and became champions of these realms in our favorite titles. Ultima, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, they're a dime a dozen. If you're a die-hard gamer, you've probably played an RPG on one of these bad boys. If you're younger, maybe your memories came from one of these. Or maybe you were lucky enough to own one of these suckers. You get the point. Role-playing games aren't going away anytime soon. All of these games have one common denominator, though. You had to pay for the privilege of embarking upon these prestigious quests. The internet as we know it was but a fleeting sci-fi pipe dream in 1985. Chips and cartridges needed to be manufactured to get these expensive productions into the hands of eager consumers, and a fair exchange needed to be made to accommodate AAA labor. Not everybody was lucky enough to have the disposable income for a dedicated games console, and that's the way it had to be. Until the status quo was challenged by the rise of macromedia flash and swathes of hobbyists stepped in, eager to diversify their creativity. The internet matured alongside its developers and engineers, ultimately reaching the point where we could watch movies, and more importantly, play games, right at our fingertips, by having a web page load files right into our browsers. No DVDs or cartridges necessary. The world was your oyster, and enthusiasts like Matt Rossack stepped up to the plate eager to take a stab at making what they loved most of all. Of course, Epic Battle Fantasy wasn't the first fully functional Flash RPG to grace the front page of Newgrounds. Plenty of other individuals pushed the limits of what was possible with an early Flash years beforehand. But EBF is graphically appealing to look at. It garnered unforeseeable popularity, so I settled for that rather than the many alternatives. Epic Battle Fantasy starts off with you splurging massive amounts of moolah to stuff your pockets full of supplies before beginning the rush proper. You control the destinies of a practical pair of adventurers scurrying across the planet to smite its many scourges, with Matt the Swordsman taking the lead and Natalie the Mage following closely behind. Together, they're going to stand in place and have intensive staring contests with the slimes until you give them commands from their vast repertoire of abilities, all of which are available to you right from the get-go. You'd think the game would basically be over by this point if Natalie can conjure divine punishment with a flick of her wrists, but like most things in life, overcoming the monstrous hordes that lie in wait is easier said than done. Gotta have an actual game to play, you know? Whatever means you use to stomp the first two slimes, two more will jump out of the bushes, then three, and so much more. Matt stops for nothing because your foes won't either. The dynamic duo face a gauntlet of enemy encounters that come one after another relentlessly, without a single overworld tile or line of exposition in sight. The game essentially strips the fat off the genre it's representing by boiling the classics down to their fundamental gameplay loops that serve as the backbone for the entire experience. Their combat, the thing you continuously do when you're not reading dialogue boxes or getting lost in colossal caves. Exceptional combat in RPGs awaken sleeping minds by rewarding versatile strategic thinking and encouraging experimentation by making select group of enemies susceptible to specific kinds of attacks. If you're making a game focused squarely around this discovery deduction-oriented loop, it better be polished and make the player ponder every move in the book. Suffice to say, EBF delivers these traits wholesomely, especially on higher difficulty settings where the stakes at risk for a misstep can be catastrophic. Matt Rossack, the developer, not the character in the game, understood why millions of gamers all around the world plowed through thousands of random encounters in the Final Fantasy series. They weren't pressing X brainlessly the entire time. They were keeping watchful eyes on their health so the next blow wouldn't be Cloud's last, and making sure the bottomless pockets were well stocked with potions in case of an emergency. All of that knapsack management and the triumphant sensation of feeling like a gifted tactician was condensed into a 40-minute to 1-hour adventure you could play straight from the internet. Not only pleasing longtime RPG players looking for a new game fix, but being many individuals' first exposure to these types of games, period. Epic Battle Fantasy was somebody's first Final Fantasy in all but name, and if I really wanted to, I could stop the retrospective right there, because I think my points have been proven. I could spend hours exemplifying the depth of this Savory Games combat if I really wanted to. During any one of the game's 23 waves, you can sheathe your current sword and draw from 7 different blades, each with their own special statistics, enhancements, and drawbacks if you're still having trouble with that meddlesome monster that you don't feel like you're doing enough damage to. On the opposite side of the coin, if the trip still feels too easy, you can limit your purchases at the shops to see how you fare with less loot on the spot. That lends itself to hours of potential optimization and replayability, provided you aren't being a cheeky cheater and looking at a guide online. These admirable merits of game design are coupled by crisp, junctioned visuals that scale with the resolution of your browser's window if you load it separately from the web page it's embedded on. The battle backgrounds are fairly static and not all that dynamic, but the expressions on the characters go above and beyond the Call of Duty. If you look closely enough, the hair is animated separately from the rest of the body. It sways in the windy breeze, and each attack was given its own hair animation. You'd be pardoned if you mistook the character art being a multi-man job. Dump all those positive flavors into a blender, and you've written yourself a recipe for a potentially timeless game. However, I must reiterate that this is the first game in what would become a long-running series, so it's far from perfect and there are numerous detrimental flaws that would be addressed in subsequent sequels. For example, the absence of a save mechanic means that busier players are square out of luck, because each session is on average a 45-minute commitment that can't be paused unless you had the gall to leave your browser running all night long. Inconvenient by every stretch of the imagination, and blissfully fixed in Epic Battle Fantasy 2. As an extent of that inconvenience, you also needed to distinguish which attacks were effective against what monsters by process of elimination, since there's no feedback on whether or not you've exploited a monster's weakness. Final Fantasy's remakes on Game Boy Advance included a bestiary so you'd be able to remind yourself what those crucial weaknesses are at any time. More on that later. Finally, the visibility of the enemy health bars can be a bit spotty sometimes, especially after casting Thunderstrike or detonating explosive missiles. Background blendage can make it unnecessarily difficult to determine whether or not you need to guzzle up some magic points in order to finish off a weary boss, when it can make a difference in critical conditions. Despite those flaws, we still have a highly enjoyable game on our hands. If you can tolerate those blunders with the user interface, go buck wild. That puts Epic Battle Fantasy to rest, but it's far from the end of the story despite what the ending might tell you. With Rossak's newfound fame all over the interwebs, it wasn't long before the folks at Armor Games sought him out and contracted him to do another one fresh off the heels of a first success. 3.5 months later, Epic Battle Fantasy 2 was born to much fanfare. Much of the sequel follows the same formula set into stone by the first game, so there's no need to echo the same sentiments. EBF1's engine eliminated most of the busy work of developing EBF2, so it was all about refinement. Therefore, it warrants a brief look. There might be too many similarities to warrant a full retrospective, but this is the one that you should make room in your schedule for. Think of it as a fully fledged expansion pack that makes your favorite game better, since that's what EBF2 is if EBF1 is the base game. The user interface was given a healthy overhaul that repositioned and recolored the enemy health bars so that they're easier to see. Upgradable statistics that randomize every single run, so no two builds will ever be alike unless you have the luck of the leprechaun. And action-oriented minigames to boost your odds of success by giving you extra wealth to spend at the shops depending on your performance. Last and most importantly, checkpoints where you can save your game and pick it up later if you've got somewhere you need to be. Nuff said. Two other things that I forgot to mention before we close this video out and wrap it up. 1. With an actual sponsorship, Matt was incentivized to remove elements from the first game that weren't entirely original. Mog the Moogle is cute, but No Legs the Cat exists independently of Square Enix. It averts legal issues, and it was a move that ultimately benefited the epic Battle Fantasy franchise in the long run, since it became its own distinguished game rather than relying upon other works to sell itself. 2. Continuing from what I said about enemy weaknesses earlier, your buddy and pal Scambot is an encyclopedia on wheels that tells you everything you need to know if you're willing to sacrifice a turn in battle, which you should on your first playthrough if it's not immediately obvious, like wood getting burned by fire. This shaves hours off the gameplay by averting game overs before they happen. Things didn't seem like they could get any better for Matt, but they did. Now is not the time to talk about the third one, though. That deserves an entire video all on its own, since it's widely considered to be one of the greatest Flash games of all time. If you're not playing that one, though, you can get your feet wet with EBF2, because it's a great game that everybody deserves in tough times like these.